Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. I'm your host, Eric Worrell. And in today's episode, we are going to be talking about the government shutdown's impact on Section 8. It's a topic that can get pretty heated at times. It can also get a few opinions thrown in there on Section 8 as it is. But what we're going to be looking at is looking at the facts of the situation and kind of going through and kind of filter out the data and explain better what's going on right now. So we'll get to that right after this.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
So I should do a full disclosure here that I am not the most educated person on Section 8. It's one of those things that I've never personally had experience with from the renting side or the landlord side. And then I also just kind of stay away from it because every time it comes up, it seems like, at least in the Facebook group, it's a lot of heated opinions around the topic. So it's something that we don't touch upon a lot with our content. But I felt like it was necessary to talk about it in the podcast this episode because the government shutdown that's currently in effect as of recording this podcast on January 15th, 2019, is going to greatly impact the housing situation here in America. And then that also means it's going to impact you, the landlord. The most obvious issue that we have is that there are a lot of government employees that are furloughed right now, so they're not receiving a paycheck, and they are going to have trouble paying rent if they're living week to week, paycheck to paycheck. We've seen this pop up in the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group where people are starting to get texts, people inquiring about this or letting their landlords know that they may be a little bit late on rent or asking for forgiveness. Unfortunately, this is a really tough spot to be in as a landlord because obviously the person has a pretty good excuse. But at the same time, you're probably not going to be able to go to your mortgage company and say, hey, can I push this mortgage payment back a month without any kind of penalty because my tenant is furloughed? So I think that's kind of the most obvious situation where you're going to have these government employees that aren't receiving payment at the current time. But Section 8 is a big piece of this. And I can say, like I mentioned earlier, I'm not the most educated on Section 8, so I had to do a little bit of research. And one of the things that I was running into is that it's the project-based Section 8 that really was getting hit the hardest at the beginning. So you may not know the difference between what tenant-based Section 8 is and project-based Section 8. Tenant-based Section 8, commonly known as the Housing Choice Voucher Program, is attached to you, the tenant. When you move, the assistants can move with you. So that's when somebody gets a housing choice voucher, they can move from place to place to place and use that voucher to help pay for a portion of their rent. And in a project-based Section 8, that is attached to a specific property. So if you move into a property that participates in the project-based Section 8 program, you get the same type of financial assistance as you would with a voucher. But if you move out, it stays with the property and it benefits the next resident of that home. So project-based, you can kind of think of it as it's going to be attached to the building, to that apartment, where tenant-based Section 8, known as Housing Choice Voucher Program, is kind of mobile and it moves with that tenant. So when this first launched with the government shutdown, I did some research, and one of the interesting things I found was that the project-based Section 8 program has been hit the hardest off the bat, right? So right out the beginning, as of January 5th, HUD failed to renew 650 rental assistance contracts that had expired in December prior to the shutdown. So the 650 contracts that HUD didn't renew in December will affect roughly 21,500 low-income households. Roughly two-thirds of these households are elderly or who have disabilities on average. These households have incomes of less than $13,000 per year. So HUD is determining whether it has the available funds that could be obligated to renew the contracts and working through the processing of these contracts to determine what could be signed if funding is available. But right now, there is no funding available due to the shutdown of the government. So to go a little bit further into this, the number of expiring contracts is going to increase as time goes on. HUD anticipates approximately 500 additional contracts affecting another 20,000 households will expire and be up for renewal in January and 550 in February. So the project-based Section 8 has been pretty much, as of December 21st, when Congress failed to provide funding for 2019 programs, including HUD, they knew as of January 5th that there was going to be issues. So January 5th hits, 650 contracts that weren't going to be renewed. And then additional 500 in January are going to be up for non-renewal, and then another 550 in February. So altogether, if my math is correct, by February, we're looking at roughly about 1,700 rental assistance contracts that are not going to be renewed. From my understanding, the reason the numbers are so large on this is that contract could be for the entire building that has many families in it. That's why when we saw 615 contracts expire in at January 5th, it affected 21,500 families. So that's the state of Section 8 project-based assistance. If you're looking at the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is probably the program that more of us are familiar with, where, like I said, it's that mobile program where that voucher travels with you. So in that particular case, the funding of that is kind of facilitated through these public housing authorities, sometimes referred to as PHAs. And with the PHAs, they did receive funding in January and expect to receive payments in February. But if the shutdown is not resolved by the end of February, these public housing authorities will not be able to make timely payments to landlords expecting rent subsidies on March 1st. This could have dire consequences for recipients of rental assistance, as they will have to either pay their rent in full or face eviction. So that's pretty huge, because the Housing Choice Voucher Program has a lot of participants to it. So what you're going to end up with now, if this goes into effect and this travels into March, is that there's pretty much no funding right now for Housing Choice Voucher programs. And I'm looking at a fact sheet that I got here from the National Center for Health and Public Housing. And it says that they have some demographic information that was obtained from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. And this was as of May 31st, 2016. They estimate that across the nation, there are over 2 million residents living in public housing and another 4.7 million residents living in Section 8 housing. So between those two programs, you can see that there's quite a few people that are living on this assistance. And it'll just be interesting to see what happens if if the shutdown isn't resolved before then, and funding isn't given to these programs, because obviously it's going to affect first and foremost the people that are living in these units that aren't going to have enough money to afford rent. But then there's also the landlords and investors who are using these programs to help subsidize the costs that these tenants can't make up. They're expecting the Public Housing Authority to come in and give them a check in the Housing Choice Voucher Program that is going to subsidize the rent of their tenant. And those people are still on the hook for their mortgages and their creditors. So it's a pretty sticky situation that has some serious trickle-down effects throughout America and through investing circles left and right, because everybody knows somebody who focuses on lower-income housing, where they may have somebody who has the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And it's a scary thing if that's what a big portion of your portfolio is wrapped up into. So, like I said, I'm not an expert by any means on these on this topic, but I've done a little bit of reading up on it. I wanted to share with you guys on the podcast just to kind of get your take on it as well. If you go to today's podcast on our website, I will link to the resources that I'm pulling from. And I also talked to a local public housing authority manager who she oversees 6,000 families in the Western New York area. And she said the same thing, is that basically there's a lot of lack of information at this point. They don't really know when funding is going to run out, if it could be mid-February, end of February. And the people at the top of the totem pole, most of them are not working right now. So it's a scary situation for a lot of people involved. And that's just another great example. People who are helping to run these public housing authorities, there's a lot of just questions kind of lingering out there, wondering what's going to happen with all these tenants that they're helping to subsidize their rents and pay the landlords on their behalf of the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So a lot to unpack here, but hopefully it all gets worked out. And again, we don't like touching too much on the political end of things, but obviously when the government shuts down, it has a huge impact on HUD and these different programs. And eventually that works its way down to the landlords and everyday people that are going to be affected by it. So it's something to look out for. And if we hear any updates, you'll see it in the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group. And perhaps we can get a PHA on the podcast in a future episode to kind of talk about their impact and what they're experiencing on their end and how this has been for them. So until next week, guys, take care and thanks for listening.